Charles Bronson, the toughest icon on American screens, the man who silenced the world with just one look. But his final years were spent in darkness. No lights. No applause. Only an empty house, the sound of wind blowing through broken windows and an untouched loneliness. Behind those steely eyes was a man who loved deeply and endured a lot. His undying love for his late wife, his complicated relationship with his children, and a sad, quiet ending were the untold final chapters of a legend. The abandoned mansion in Malibu is now just an empty shell of memories, while the tens of millions of dollars he left behind are not truly preserved. If you believe that memories like that should not be forgotten, subscribe to the Final Legacy channel. Because there are lives that can only truly come back to life when told with respect. In his later years, Charles Bronson was no longer the lonely, tough man with a gun in his hand that we once saw on screen. He quietly withdrew from the spotlight and began an unwinnable war, this time not with criminals but with time. Alzheimer's disease came like an uninvited guest, silently taking away every piece of memory he had accumulated throughout his life. The roles that once captivated audiences, Bernardo, Danny Valinsky, Paul Kersey, are now just strange names in his mind. The man who once memorized hundreds of pages of dialogue, sometimes can't even remember his daughter's name. He began to forget meal times. He even forgot the mornings when he made tea with his wife, a habit that he used to keep as a small ritual of love. And sometimes, he forgot who he was. But Alzheimer's wasn't the only thing that brought him down. The lung disease that had been a result of a lifetime of inhaling coal dust, cigarette smoke, and war gradually left him tired and short of breath, and he had to live with an oxygen tank for many years. Finally, lung cancer quietly took over his body as if it were the end of a journey whose endurance had run out. On August 30, 2003, in a small hospital in Los Angeles, Charles Bronson took his last breath. There were no gunshots, no lights, no cameras. Just an empty room, a few clasped hands, and a long, suffocating silence. After his death, Bronson was laid to rest in a place far from the glitz and harshness of Hollywood. A quiet resting place at Brownsville Cemetery in West Windsor, Vermont. This place held deep personal meaning for him. Maybe you saw him on a blurry screen in the 70s. Maybe your father once called him the last man of real cinema. And now, he leaves as he once lived, quietly, resiliently, without needing a farewell. Charles Bronson, the hero of a generation, has left the stage, without needing a grand finale. Just a bow, and the memory remains. After Charles Bronson passed away, the Malibu mansion where he lived with Jill Ireland gradually fell silent. The house was once filled with the laughter of 7 children, the soft sound of the piano in the morning, and the smell of tea that Bronson made for his wife every night. Now, over the years, moss has grown around the roof, the wooden doors have turned yellow, the wall with family photos has faded under the dust of time. No one has lived there for long. His second wife, Kim Weeks, received most of the assets, then withdrew from the media. The children, each in their own way, chose to live privately, not continuing their father's journey to fame. His estate is estimated at $45 to $65 million, including the Malibu mansion, the farm in Vermont, and the still profitable film copyrights. But it seems that the most precious thing that no one has been able to keep is the family atmosphere that once existed there. Inside the mansion, people say there is still an old leather chair, a teacup with a J engraved on it for Jill, and a handwritten letter he wrote but never sent. And that house still sits quietly on the Malibu hillside. No one speaks inside, no one turns on the radio. Just the wind blowing through the windows and memories that no one recalls. He was born not in the limelight but in the coal mines of Pennsylvania in 1921 with the humble name of Charles Buczynski. The 11th of 15 children, Bronson grew up in poverty, with nothing but calloused hands and a will to survive that was required by the times. As a teenager, he worked as a miner, silently breathing in coal dust and the hardships of the American working class. Later, he joined the army, fought in World War II, fought in the Pacific, and returned with a wound and a Purple Heart. Not glory, but things that will never be told. Bronson came to cinema as a late destiny. He played supporting roles in dozens of films from House of Wax to Vera Cruz, before breaking through with The Magnificent Seven in 1960. From then on, people no longer saw him as a film miner, but as an icon, a hero who needed no embellishment. While Hollywood was still busy looking for bright faces, Europe welcomed Bronson with open arms. He became an international star thanks to Once Upon a Time in the West, where his eyes silenced the entire frame. By the 1970s, with the Death Wish series, he became one of the highest-paid actors, earning over $1 million per film, not because of his special effects but because he was real. No one gave him a halo. He walked in and stood there quietly like a rock in the rush of the entertainment industry. Behind the determined eyes on the screen is a man who has known hunger, worn his brother's old clothes, and slept in the cold without a heater. Charles Bronson, or rather, Charles Buczynski, is the embodiment of a hardscrabble America where men grow up not learning to express their emotions, but only knowing how to carry everything on their shoulders. His childhood was never really a childhood. At the age of 10, Bronson worked as a coal miner to support his family. At 16, he lost his father. At 20, he enlisted in the army, went to the Pacific Theater of World War II, and returned with an invisible wound that never fully healed. Charles Bronson was first married to Harriet Tendler, a radio announcer who had been with him when he was an unknown actor. She was his support during the difficult early years of his career. They had 2 children together, but over time, as Bronson became famous and his life took a different turn, the marriage gradually fell apart. They divorced in 1965, quietly and without scandal. Though rarely mentioned later, Harriet was still part of the journey that shaped the quiet man the world knew. 3 years later, on October 5, 1968, Charles Bronson remarried the British actress Jill Ireland, the most important woman in his life. She was gentle, intelligent, but also strong enough to stand next to a man like Bronson, who lived in a closed inner world and rarely let anyone in. Their 22-year marriage was not only a connection of love, but also a fusion of creativity. Together they made more than 15 films, raised 7 children, biological, stepchildren, and adopted children. The family was not perfect. They argued, disagreed, sometimes drifted apart, but then came back together as if the world outside could change, but between them, love was constant. Jill once said, "Charles was not an easy person to approach. But when he quietly put his hand on your shoulder, you knew, that was the way he loved." And Bronson loved her in that way, silently, without fanfare, but as deep as a rock under the river. When Jill was diagnosed with cancer, Bronson stopped all projects, stepped back from the spotlight to be with his wife during each treatment session. He did not cry in front of the camera. He did not make emotional speeches. He just quietly held her hand in the hospital as if he held it tight enough, the pain would not come near. After Jill passed away in 1990, Charles Bronson seemed to no longer be himself. Although he later remarried to Kim Weeks, his third wife, and still had children by his side, that once-filled house now became a quiet space where he lived for the rest of his life. And perhaps, in the heart of that seemingly ironclad man, Jill never left. Charles Bronson did not enter Hollywood like the handsome men who had landed on the screen at that time. He did not have a smile that melted the hearts of female audiences, nor did he have a romantic quality that made people dream. He came to cinema with a face that had known sweat and dust, with eyes that had seen war and poverty, and with a deep inner self that no one, including his co-stars, dared to enter. At first, Bronson accepted small roles. Standing quietly at the end of the frame, he was the third soldier from the left, the first bad guy to fall in the gunfight scene. But his eyes were not small. They quietly looked straight into the lens as if asking the audience, "Do you know what I did to get here?" He did not demand, did not compete. He just persevered through each role, each scene, until he could no longer be forgotten. Audiences began to remember him in House of Wax, then The Magnificent Seven, where he played Bernardo, a Mexican warrior, gruff but loyal. People could not take their eyes off him every time he appeared. Not because he tried to do anything special. It was because he did nothing, just existed, and that presence, so real. Then came The Great Escape. Danny Valinsky, the Tunnel King, was not the center of the story, but he carved a loneliness into it that made the character live forever in the minds of viewers. The man did not smile, did not show off, just dug tunnels in the dark, just as Bronson had dug his own way out during his years in the coal mines. But if America only saw him as a second-rate actor, Europe saw in Bronson what Hollywood had forgotten: the weight of silence. Once Upon a Time in the West is a sad symphony where Bronson holds a harmonica, stands in the middle of a vast desert, and without saying a word, makes the audience hold their breath. Sergio Leone, the film's director, once said, "He doesn't act, he is himself." Since then, the name Charles Bronson has resonated not only in America but all over the world. And then Death Wish, the film that turned him into an icon. Paul Kersey, a man who lost his wife, lost his child, lost his faith, walked out into the street with a gun in his hand, carrying a wordless rage. This role divided America. Half called him a promoter of violence. Half saw him as a symbol of self-justice in a hopeless time. Bronson, however, did not speak. He never tried to explain his character. He let the audience see what they needed to see. Throughout the 70s and 80s, he became one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. $1 million per film. But he still lived like a man who grew up on dry bread and water. No parties. No stars on the boulevard. No attention-grabbing statements. He went to work on time, left the set early, and went home, where he gardened, read, and cared for his wife and children. Charles Bronson's career wasn't built on strategy, advertising, or power-grabbing. It was built on being a man who didn't need to act to convince a generation that he was real. Charles Bronson never tried to leave a legacy. He did not give an acceptance speech, he did not step onto the podium to talk about his journey. The only thing he left behind was a feeling. A feeling so real, so human, and so hard to name. He was more of a memory than a character. No noise, no color. But anyone who saw him on screen remembers it. Remembers the way he walked slowly, looked deeply, and spoke short, chilling sentences. Remembers his tough, lonely figure, as if he carried on his shoulders all the silence of a generation. What made Bronson different was not that he stood out in Hollywood. It was that he did not need to stand out to make people pause. There was something very old, very American, very fatherly about him. A man who did not reveal much, but always knew how to stand up at the right time and in the right place. The legacy he left behind is not in the list of films. It is in the hearts of those who grew up when he was a familiar face on the small screen. In the memory of late evenings, when the whole family sat together, the lights dimmed and he stepped out of the frame like a familiar person, without introduction. Charles Bronson is a reminder that strength does not need to be shown. The right does not need applause. And love, sometimes is not about hugging or promising but just staying, enduring together, until the end. When he left, he did not leave behind a lesson. But those who knew him, who watched him, learned something for themselves. That there are people who just need to quietly live out their roles, is enough to not be forgotten. Maybe you watched Charles Bronson on the old TV in your parents' living room. Maybe you heard the soundtrack to Death Wish late one night, when the whole family was asleep, and you were still sitting there watching a man walking through the night. If he was a part of your memories, if his roles ever made you speechless, or made your father look into the distance for no apparent reason, then share it in the comments. Because sometimes, just a flashback is enough to keep that memory from being forgotten. If you cherish stories like this, if you want to join us in preserving the lives that are gradually sinking into silence, subscribe to the Final Legacy channel. Not to follow, but to accompany. We are here, not to tell the things that no one has told, but to help you remember the things that no one wants to forget.